So I'll turn it over to Marty and his team. Thanks, and welcome everybody.
Hey, I'm Marty Walker, and one of the students that worked at Stanford on the cochlear implant. As we all know, the goal of an auditory prosthesis system is to enable the deaf to understand speech without lip reading. This goal has largely been accomplished today through multi-channel cochlear implants. You may not know that the multi-channel cochlear implants got their start at Stanford in the early 1970s under the direction of two professors, Blair Simmons at the med school and Robert White in electrical engineering. As a grad student, I knew these professors as Doc White and Dr. Simmons, and that's how I will refer to them today. We're going to talk about the work done at Stanford that led to the development of today's cochlear implants, which have helped over 1 million deaf people understand speech and even appreciate music. In particular, we'll discuss the development of the portable system we called the PSP-2. Doc White's interest in auditory prosthesis developed during a sabbatical at Oxford University during the 69 to 70 academic year. He was drawn to the goal of developing a cochlear prosthesis after reading a paper by Dr. Simmons, who had implanted an electrode in the inner ear of a deaf person who could then hear simple sounds, but not actual words. Doc White then founded the Stanford Institute for Electronics and Medicine in the early 1970s and led the Stanford project for over 15 years with successive generations of grad students. Before discussing the PSP development, I wanted to recognize contributors to the auditory prosthesis project. As I said, Doc White founded the Institute in 1975, and one of the first set of students, Tushar Giwala, developed the first generation of implantable electronics. Rob Matthews, who will be speaking a little later today, joined the group in 1974, and I came along about a year later. By 1978, the development of the electronics had reached a point that we were ready to implant our first patients. And by the end of 1978, we also developed PSP-2, the first portable multi-channel stimulation system. Matt Herndon and Les Atlas followed Rob and me and really made the PSP-2 into something useful. Here's a picture of PSP-2 that we developed at Stanford University. On the left, I'm holding the briefcase that is the PSP-2, the electronics that we developed. We've donated PSP-2 to the Computer History Museum in nearby Mountain View, California, and it will be on display there beginning this summer. On the right, our panelist, Dr. Cooperman, is showing her modern electronics, so we can see how far cochlear implants have advanced. Now let's look at a little bit more detail on what's inside that briefcase. To help us get oriented, this slide shows a high-level block diagram of the system. Basically, the system comprises two parts. The external electronics receives sound from the environment and processes the audio so as to determine the stimulation on each of the electrodes in the system. This information is transmitted to the internal unit, which decodes the received digital signals and drives the electrodes accordingly. The electrodes were implanted in the auditory nerve of our subjects. Although the right-hand side, that is the internal unit in the above diagram, was expected to be implanted in the mastoid process of our subjects, in PSP-2, this block is included in the briefcase and wires directly connect PSP-2 to the implanted electrodes. So all of the electronics shown are contained in the briefcase as indicated in this slide. The PSP-2 is connected to the implanted electronics through a transcutaneous connector as shown in the middle of this slide. You can see that there are 5 pins on this connector, and these correspond to each of the 4 electrodes and ground. Our first subjects received their 4-channel implants in late 1977. As I mentioned before, these were the first portable, i.e., that is outside of the OR, multi-channel auditory implants that were ever implanted and tested. So before we could begin to program this system, we had to understand the relationship between stimulation of the nerve and perception of sounds by our subjects. Rob Matthews and I started to work on the project after the implantable electronics developed by the prior generation of students had been successfully tested in vitro. We were present when the first 2 patients received their implants, and we designed and built the systems for characterizing the relationship between stimulation and perception of sounds, as well as the portable stimulation system. As you might imagine, we wanted to design our systems to be as flexible as possible. We had little or no preconceived notions of what algorithms might be effective, so we designed a software-defined system, both for characterization as well as speech processing, which was quite an advance given the capabilities of computers in that time frame. In today's parlance, we'd refer to these as platforms and explain that we provided implementation and debugging environments for both characterization and speech processing. Rob Matthews is going to talk about the work we did to characterize the system, and in particular, he'll describe the automated system he designed to conduct and document the relationship between stimulus and perception. He will give some details about the process itself and summarize some of our findings. Then I'll talk in more detail about the hardware we developed for this process. I'll give more details about the hardware and software architecture of the PSP2 system. Now, Matt and Les took these systems and made the fundamental advances that really made the PSP work. So Les will conclude this forum with a discussion of their findings and the performance of the system. So let me introduce Dr. Rob Matthews, who will pick up the story from here. Rob finished his PhD in 1978 and then continued working on the prosthesis project as a postdoc. From 1979 to 1983, he was an assistant professor in electrical engineering, originating and teaching the Meade-Conway VLSI design classes. Later, he co-founded Silicon Solutions, which developed a system for simulating integrated circuit designs. And later, he joined me at another startup, Frequency Technology. Rob, take it away.
Okay, Marty, thank you. Next slide, please. So as Marty mentioned, what I'm going to focus on is the platforms that we built for working with human subjects. And I'll talk I'll talk both about the hardware and software side, but my contributions were dominantly on the software side. So after I'm not going to talk much about PSP2 itself. I'll let Marty do that after I do my bit here. Okay, next slide, please. So as Marty mentioned, I joined the auditory prosthesis project in 1974. So that was before Marty and before Les or Matt, that, you know, Marty's mentioned all of these people. What I brought to the project was significant background in software, but also some signal processing. And I had some interest in speech. I tried to do software for things like format extraction and so forth. The way I got involved in the project was I took Doc White's class that he was teaching at the time on biological information processing. And I'm pretty sure he probably would have talked a little about the auditory prosthesis project in the class, but one way or another, I ended up writing a term paper where I, went to the library, did a lot of looking at the human auditory system and speculated about how speech perception might actually work in the human auditory system. So I guess one way or another, we impressed each other, and I ended up joining his project as a PhD student. Okay, next slide, please. Now, at the time I joined, a previous student, Tushar Giwala, had been working on his thesis, and he'd already developed and built an implantable stimulator, which he called Stimulus 4. So Stimulus 4 was a delivered 4 channels of monopolar stimulus, and it was biphasic stimuli. So the block diagram of it you can see here, where their data and power are transmitted across whatever the barrier is. I mean, we didn't actually implant this, so the barrier was actually, air. But and then the internal part of it received the data and power, and then decoded the data stream and used it to drive the electrodes. Okay, so next slide, please. Marty, oh, there we go, thanks. So yeah, Tushar actually built this using some capabilities in the Stanford Integrated Circuits Lab. And so the thing was small enough that it conceivably could have been implanted. A little big for the mastoid, but possible. The other thing is that he built it using what was a new semiconductor technology at that point, CMOS, which is now absolutely ubiquitous everywhere. But at the time it was pretty new, and the key factor there was it's low power. It can be very low power. So those were, 2 good things about the implant. Another good thing was because of the air gap between the actual implantable electronics and the driving electronics, there was electrical isolation there. And also, inside of the device, there was DC isolation. So the device was a pretty safe thing to use for stimulating human subjects. On the flip side, we only had monopolar stimulus coming out, and there were lots of restrictions on the stimulus pattern itself. Pulse rate restrictions on how closely we could space 2 different pulses that we drove out, and we had no control of wave shape. But we were just building on the immediate past of the project here, Marty and me. And so we used Stimulus 4 for everything we did in our prosthesis research.
Rob?
Yep.
Zach is asking, what's in the middle of the transmitter coil? A magnet?
No, the middle is an ultrasound unit. It's either for transmitting or receiving ultrasound. So this was not set up to actually magnetically attach.
Cool,
But
thanks.
that thing in the center is actually the on the left is the ultrasound transmitter, and on the right is the ultrasound receiver for the data coming into the device. Okay, we good? Okay, next slide, please. So Tushar was busily building these things, and he really needed a better way to test them. So it turned out that the software guy came on the project, and the first thing he did was build hardware. So I built a lab box, basically, that Tushar could use to test his Stimulus 4 units and characterize them and so forth. The main ongoing value for this was it included all of the logic for encoding data for Stimulus 4. So I believe we reused that design, or maybe, well, it would have been the design. We reused the design when we built subsequent hardware. Okay, next slide, please. Now, that hardware wasn't my thesis. My thesis topic was sound processing for an auditory prosthesis. So the general idea I had was you have the speech signal, you want to analyze it somehow, and then you want to map it into stimuli that create a set of perceived sounds. But there was this problem, because we really had no idea, well, not no idea, we had very little idea what our subjects were going to hear. What were these things going to sound like? Dr. Simmons had done some prior work that was relevant, so we had some general idea, but we really didn't know. And so here I am with my thesis, and I'm looking at let's just say a big obstacle, because for me to make progress, we needed to have human subjects to work with. Okay, next slide, please. Now, bear with me for a little bit here. Meanwhile, over in the geophysics department, Professor John Claerbout had a significant size research project sponsored by the oil companies. And what he was working on was signal processing for basically, imaging what the strata are down in the earth. Because that's obviously big clues about whether there would be gas and oil trapped down there. But he had a very particular problem, which is he needed to produce plots of the general kind that I'm showing over on the other side. You can imagine you arrange these things so what you're trying to do is process the signal so it looks like the strata underground. And they're called wiggle trace plots. But at the time, these things were hard to plot. You needed a specialized kind of printer plotter for it, and the campus computer center could not keep the printer plotter running. So this was constantly getting in the way of Dr. Claerbout's students and Claerbout's research. So his answer was, oh, heck, we'll get a mini computer system. We'll calculate it over the computer center. We'll write the results onto these. Now, these are the mag tapes, that you see in old science fiction movies that are about a foot across. Write a mag tape, bring it over to his very own computer system, and print on the Versatech printer plotter. Now, I don't know exactly how he thought he was going to build this, but this was his idea. Okay, next slide, please. What actually happened was this. He ended up with a system, he and his students, that was a PDP-11 running Unix. I think this was the first Unix system running on the Stanford campus. So you had text terminals, those were the terminals of the day, and then had a mag tape, but only used for backups, and had the Versatech that he needed to do the printer plotter, plus what were for the day some fairly large disk drives on it, all of 300 megabytes apiece, and something else called an array processor, but that doesn't matter for the story here. So he had a system that was like way more capable than what he had originally envisioned, and it grew this way so that it could handle the relatively large for the time geophysics data sets. So inside of geophysics, this was a resounding success. The students completely abandoned the computer center, and they did all of their computing on the PDP-11. So now, but where the heck did this come from? Okay, next slide, please. It turns out at the time that there was some cooperation between a professor I knew, Professor Martin Morf in electrical engineering, and Professor Claerbout on signal processing. And Dr. Morf convinced Claerbout, oh, you want to run Unix? And he said, well, how's this going to happen? And Morf said, oh, I know some EE students who can help you. So 3 of us became the geophysics IT department before there were IT departments. 2 friends of mine and I, we booted Unix on his 1134. We learned Unix, we learned C, we supported his system, and then I wrote the drivers that he needed for the printer plotter, for the disks, other devices, and I also got the Versatech set up so you could typeset on it. That was a pretty new thing at the time. It means you could actually do things like print a research paper with figures included on the Versatech. Now, I probably put a solid man-year into this. All the meanwhile, Doc White, I think he knew what was going on. He didn't complain about any of it because I think there was this important quid pro quo, which is Dr. Claerbout agreed to let us EEs use the system, his system, for our research. Now, the other 2 guys didn't end up using it, but this ended up being an absolutely critical resource for the auditory prosthesis project. Okay, so next slide, please. The reason this was important is because Marty and I, and also at this point, I forget when Matt joined, we were already considering what it was going to take to work with the human subjects, and we realized we'd be performing lots and lots of experiments with them. And every experiment was going to require setup, every experiment would require bookkeeping, and it was just going to be a load. The other thing was we knew that we had to be able to react quickly because we didn't know what we were going to find when we started doing the experiments. So we needed to be able to define new experiments quickly in order to keep things moving along. So the solution is we built a software-driven platform to conduct these basic characterization experiments. There was custom hardware that Marty and my friends built. I may have built some of it for the human interface to the PDP-11, and then software that Matt Herndon and I built for automating the tests, analyzing the data, just doing all of the logging that otherwise would have been this laborious by hand process. I think that pretty much, at least on the medical world at that point, this I think was completely state of the art. I think pretty much everybody in the medical world hadn't had an opportunity to use computers this way to do this kind of thing. So it was I think a unique resource for the auditory prosthesis project. Next slide, please. So this is what the setup looked like. There was the geophysics PDP-11 with a standard interface in it. And then we built an interface for our outboard hardware. And here on the picture on the left, you can see the two, what we call laptop boxes. One for the experimenter, one for the subject. The subjects contained a stimulus 4 inside the box and a plug and a cable that he could plug in behind his ear to stimulate his electrodes. So that each box had, various kinds of input devices. In particular, it had, buttons and slide potentiometers. And it did have an emergency shutoff button at the top that if things got like too loud or something went wrong, that our subjects could whack that button and shut everything down instantly. So in order to support all of this, I wrote Unix drivers for the system. And I also modified the Unix kernel because we needed to go sort of semi-real time in order to do this. So this was the system we used for our characterization. Next slide, please. Now, additionally, Matt and I created a language for defining experiments. And it's mostly just, I'll give you an example in a sec. It's mostly just a big table defining what goes on in an experiment. And then the idea was you define all of the pieces of the experiment, including, like the routine stuff you need, the directions to the subject, what to do, the directions to the experimenter, what to do, what the experiment was supposed to do, but also all of the actual delivery of the stimulus, recording of the results, logging, and so forth. So what we would do is we'd write an experiment in this language, then we compile it, and now we'd have a runnable experiment. Then we could conduct the experiment, and it would do, in addition to driving all of the hardware and running the experiment in the order we wanted, it'd log everything. At the end of that, then we had everything logged electronically, and we wrote various kinds of software for digesting the results. Okay, next slide, please. This is an example of the language. You can breathe a sigh of relief. I'm not going to go through all of this, but just you can see some of the things I talked about, like the instructions, excuse me, the instructions to the subject, description of the experiment, but also you can get an idea in some of the parts of it, like sort of in the bottom of the middle column, you can see we assigned functions to the buttons. And we're basically saying, here's what we want logged. Whether the subject is saying same, different, or please repeat the stimulus. This is a full definition of an experiment for frequency difference limits for pulse pairs. This is the whole thing. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, we have very few photos from back in the day, but this is one of them. So here I am, with a lot more hair and a mustache, working with one of our first 2 human subjects. And you can see the laptop boxes. You can see that our subject has one in his lap, and you can see the cable going from behind his ear down to the laptop box. And then, you know, I have equipment in front of me to be able to run the experiment also. Now, Claerbout was certainly as good as his word. He gave us exclusive access to his computer system mornings, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. This is when I shifted from being a night owl to being a morning person. But this was quite generous. 4 days a week, the system was ours for 2 hours a day, and we went on using it for months, and he was perfectly okay with that. So it let us do all of this experimentation with a lot of automation. Now, this is just on the lower right, you can see just a plot of, it doesn't really matter what it is, but we were able to take data from multiple experiments and pool it together if we wanted to, and then make plots like this on the Versatech plotter. So we were able to actually automate a heck of a lot of the project's, you know, routine of dealing with experiments and experimental data. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just to give you a little bit of sense of timeline. I'm going to turn it over to Marty shortly to talk about the sound processors themselves, the portable sound processors. But what I was talking about mostly here was the characterization. So we did the implants, as Marty mentioned, in you know, like late summer '77. And then we started working with, Marty and I started working, and Matt started working with the human subjects. But before that, we had to get the platform together. Then we continued to do experimentation with them pretty much solidly, except for, you know, holidays and Christmas, all through into January or February. I forget when we stopped. Now, in the meantime, Marty and the hardware guys had been working on portable sound processors. So this all overlapped. Now, as Marty said, we wanted them to be software designed because we didn't know what was going to come out of the experimentation work we were doing at the same time as we were trying to design these sound processors. Okay, so let me turn it back over to Marty now, and he can tell you the story of the sound processors.
Yeah. Thanks, Rob. So I'm going to provide some details about the hardware we developed for use in the speech processing system. And you know, as Rob discussed, we knew that our system had to be very flexible. The system was performing the processing for the stimulation of the first multi-channel implants, so we had almost nothing to base our design on. So all we knew is that we didn't know what algorithms or parameters were going to work. So that led us to the primary design philosophy: make the hardware as generic as possible and do all the processing in the software, and make sure that the hardware incorporated sufficient processing power to make our algorithms feasible. The main constraint was that this system had to be portable and battery powered. Unfortunately, a CMOS processor, which uses much less power than the NMOS processors available from Intel, for example, was just becoming available. And this processor, the Intel IM6100, was basically a DEC PDP-8 on a chip. During this period, as Rob showed in the previous slide, we developed 3 different processors. The earliest, PSP0 and PSP1, were sort of temporary stopgap measures. We wanted to provide our subjects with something that might benefit them outside the lab, and for all of us to get experience with portable electronics. So here's the basic design of our first system. This system, as shown here, is using a single CPU, and thus was only able to support a very simple sound processing strategy of just power estimation. We stimulated 1 electrode at a fixed rate, and the stimulation magnitude was related to the short-term power estimate. We computed the stimulation magnitude following the perceived loudness mapping that we discovered during the experiments, which Rob was describing earlier. This system was used by one of our subjects, and he reported that he could identify the dogs barking and other environmental sounds, such as a passing motorcycle and people talking. Now, he was able to use this system to improve his lip readings as he could distinguish syllables.
Marty?
Yes.
So the fact that you had one electrode you were stimulating, was that because of computational limits or because you didn't know what to do with the rest?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Frankly, this was, we really didn't know what to do. It was more, yes, it was, here's something we could do. And we're still learning about the system. We're still learning about experimentation and mapping the system. And we couldn't do much more with just one processor. As I talked about here, in our next generation, I developed some sort of special purpose electronics, but still using just one processor to do a little bit better, to do a little bit more job. And we were stimulating 3 electrodes simultaneously with this system, but it was still a very simple processing system. Using this system, our subjects reported that they were able to distinguish multiple environmental sounds at once, and it also led to improved lip reading capabilities. Now, in this next slide, here's the box that I showed you. Here's the inside of the box that sort of a close-up of the box that I showed you earlier. This is PSP2, which is the first one that really had enough processing power to implement sophisticated speech processing algorithms. Now, our subjects were able to carry this around in a briefcase, and the briefcase then stimulated the implantable electrodes, as we described earlier. This hardware was first operational in May 1978, and the power consumption was about a half a watt only, which resulted in about 20 hours of battery life. The whole thing, including batteries and the briefcase, weighed about 5 pounds, so it was sort of portable. This next slide shows a close-up. This next slide is sort of the block diagram. Is somebody asking a question or?
Sorry.
Go ahead, Marty.
Okay, this next slide, this is a block diagram of the signal processing system in PSP2, in keeping with our original design philosophy. The only special purpose dedicated hardware was the interface to the stimulus electronics. All of the other processing was performed by the software. The input analog processing included an analog low-pass filter with about a 1.8 kilohertz cutoff. And we also used about a 200 hertz high-pass filter to minimize unwanted environmental sounds and simplify our processing. We sampled this input at the rate of 4 kilosamples per second, consistent with the 1.8 kilohertz bandwidth low-pass filter. Now, it was clear from PSP0 that a single processor did not have the processing power to implement the speech processing algorithms. Accordingly, we designed a pipeline of processors to implement our algorithms. And this slide sort of shows the block diagram of our multiprocessor system. As I mentioned earlier, we used the IM6100, which required about 3 microseconds per instruction. With a 4K sample rate on the input, that meant that the first microprocessor could only execute about 80 instructions per sample. And since the IM6100 didn't have a hardware multiply instruction, so the DSP algorithms we designed had to be simple and perform enough compression so that the subsequent processing and the second and third processors would be possible. This next slide shows some details of our first sound processing algorithm. The first processor implements 3 bandpass filters and initial feature extraction. It reduces the data rate to the second microprocessor by about a factor of 4, which means the second microprocessor could use about 300 instructions per data sample. The second microprocessor was used to estimate the power in each band and perform some level of format extraction. The third microprocessor derived the simulation level and time, and then mapped the stimulation and mapped the requirements onto the stimulus electrodes. This slide shows a detailed view of the signal processing electronics used in this system. It shows over on the right-hand side shows the 3 IM6100 microprocessors, and along off to the left of each of the microprocessors is the memory, which was a whopping 12K bits of memory, or 1K word, 1K of memory per processor. And the result was that the subjects were able to use the PSP2, and it provided sound cues and some very limited speech cues, but nothing that sounded to them like speech. And we definitely didn't achieve open speech recognition at this point. By the way, we also developed a development in a control system for the PSP2 system, which I implemented using a separate IM6100 CPU that we used to manage the load and monitor the system. Included an interface to the host mini computer, which we used to load programs, to monitor the operation of the individual processors. And we're able to debug the software using a symbolic debugger, which let us insert breakpoints into the code and translate symbolic addresses into memory locations. And, you know, as I mentioned, it was really the next generation of researchers, Les and Matt, who made the real progress striving towards open set speech recognition. Les is here from Washington to fill us in on the later stages of the project. After leaving the prosthesis project in 1984, Les Atlas joined the electrical and computer engineering department at the University of Washington as an assistant professor. He has since been a leader in signal processing research and educational activity in the Pacific Northwest. Les's research has had an impact on applications in acoustics, machine monitoring, sensor arrays, speech processing, and auditory sciences. And Les will now pick up the story from here.
Thank you, Marty. I was so lucky to be on this project. As I hear the history, it reminds me of how amazing it was to be working within the state-of-the-art, new state-of-the-art in digital and analog electronics on this project, to have these tools at our disposal, but also to be working with such brilliant people, Blair Simmons, Robert White, and the graduate students I worked with, the brilliant guys like Marty and Rob and Matt, who were around there, and then the visitors we had. I'll come back to some of the visitors. Some of the visitors we got back then are in our audience now, like Dick Line, who had big influence on the stuff I'll be talking about. We'll come back to some of the other visitors we had as we were doing subject testing experiments, trying to get open set speech. Next slide, please. So I want to give some thanks to Jay Rubenstein, who's the director of the Hearing Research Center at my University of Washington. He's helped me with some of the historical memories of what happened with cochlear implants. He does cochlear implants, and he's a great surgeon. And that's a picture of Bill Gates Sr., who has a cochlear implant. Next slide. And so what happened is, you can see that in this picture here, PSP2, which Marty was talking about and Rob did a lot of the software for, I got the thing working and added some custom boards and controls. And that attaché case you're looking at there, I got to know it very well. Drilled some extra holes, put some more potentiometers to control other things. And the key question we had is, if we provide enough cues, can our subject or subjects learn open set speech perception, where they could be talking on the phone, where they aren't just using it as an aid to lip reading, but open set. And so that was our overarching goal. That was our main goal. And our subject, RF, great subject to work with, a funny guy, very, very dedicated to the project. He took this processor home, the one you're looking at right here. Once it got it working, I handed it to him. I said, okay, take it home. Tell me how it works. Use it as much as you can. The more you use it, maybe the better you're going to do. So we had initial tests that were done on RF in terms of his open set speech. I can say it was basically chance. As a lip reading aid, it was great. Environmental aid, it was great. But we wanted the open set. So he took the processor home. A day later, he called Dr. Simmons' office to say his processor stopped working. Then I got contacted by the staff, from Simmons' staff, and I met RF to get his processor working. I think I met him at the airport. This is before airports were so secure. And he handed it to me, and I looked at it, and I said, it's not working. Why is it not working? I brought it back to the lab and looked at it. And I realized that there's the board that's sitting on the top, the medium-sized board. There's a really small board way on in the lid, but there's a large board in the bottom, and then there's the medium-sized board. That medium-sized board was shorting out with the larger board. That medium-sized board was a wire wrap board that I designed, put together. I wire wrapped it myself. Unfortunately, it was contacting some of the pins on the large board, the board that Marty made a printed circuit for. So what you can see there is the insulator I added, which was computer printout paper with some of Rob's code, original code there from 40 odd years ago, that's sitting there between the medium-sized board and the large board, and that fixed the problem. That was a quick insulator. We didn't intend this to be a rugged device that was going to last for a long time. We wanted to see over weeks, maybe months, can we get open set speech? And I can say right now, we didn't, but we had some insights that helped us get to that point. And while the subject certainly benefited from this processor, wanted to use it as much as possible, I heard immediately when it stopped working, which happened every now and then, there was still no evidence of open set speech comprehension. Let's go to the next slide. So that was our working hypothesis, open set speech. We were funded by the NIH. And we had, in 1979, there were several outside experts who were brought in for a site visit of our NIH project. It was a fair amount of money that was funding. I was just paying for my assistantship, paying for a lot of this equipment and parts that you're looking at, paying for our time, paying for the time of Simmons and White. And the two main visitors, site visitors, one was Nelson Kang, the other's Lou Breda, both from MIT. And both, if you know them, they've both passed away now, but these are not two people who mince words. They do not hold back their opinions. And they were complimentary of our skills and our methods, but were disappointed, to say the least, that we had not yet achieved open set speech comprehension. They actually felt at that point in time that cochlear implant technology would never provide open set speech comprehension, that we were maybe wasting our time. I felt awful when this happened. I thought, what can we do with what we have here? Of course I want people who are deaf and implanted to get open set speech. That's our overarching goal. Next slide, please. So then I started to question our current acceptance, our current assumptions. And the way that people at that point in time looked at cochlear implants was that there were really two variables. One was loudness, the other was pitch. And the question was, if you could control loudness and pitch, which we could do, we found by pulse rate corresponded to pitch of a perception over some range, and if you can control loudness, small amount of current versus a large amount of current or charge would affect the loudness of the percept. Can you use that to convey speech? And if you can do that, how would you do that? We only had 3 or 4 electrodes, the medullas, so people assumed since format vocoders were argued that they worked, that the way to do this was to use format vocoding, where you pick out the peaks in the spectrum, convey the peaks as pitch. Okay, I'm going to say that again. Convey the peak locations and frequency as pitches, that is pulse rate. Send that into the electrodes with a loudness that's appropriate to the level of each of those peaks or formats. And that should give speech. That should be enough information. And the justification for that was that format synthesizers seem to work, particularly something called sine wave speech, where you substitute a sine wave, pure tone, for each of the 3 or 4 formats, play it, and you should get speech perception, open set perception by a normal listener listening to this kind of synthesized speech. And so I heard that statement. I figured, I'm going to try this and see if it works on me. Back then, my hearing was normal. I put together a system. This is a duplication, essentially, of the system that I looked at back in the late 1970s, early 1980s to see how it sounds. So let's try the 3 or 4 format sine wave speech.
Nature's first green is gold, her farthest pure gold. Early leaves of flower, where only so lower, then leaves subsides the leaf, so inside the grief, so dull goes down the day, nothing gold can save.
So I don't know how many words you got out of that. That was not a perfect fidelity duplication of what cochlear implant subjects hear, but it's the information that's contained in sine wave synthesized from 3 to 4 formats in what you just heard. And when I listened to that, and I was a little astounded because I didn't like it. But it was weird. You can understand why some people thought it was okay, because if you knew what was going to be said, it sounded reasonable. If you were in the mode of thinking, hey, this is speech I'm listening to, I know what those words are, it sounds reasonable. So the first time you heard something where you didn't have a script of what was being said, it didn't work too well. I would bring people in the lab. I'd have them put headphones and I'd say, pick out a word or two from what I'm playing you. Can you identify any words you hear? And usually they couldn't identify any, so I thought something's wrong with what we're doing. Using format synthesis, using pitch to convey resonances in the vocal tract is probably not a good idea based on how this sounded. And back then, people had other ways of doing speech synthesis like linear prediction, so there were alternatives, and so I made a case back then that maybe we could do better, but let's play the naturally spoken so you can hear what that was.
Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief, so dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay.
So if you got a few words out of the sine wave synthesized speech from the formats, you're doing better than most people. That was a Robert Frost poem. Now that you've heard what those words are, if you went back and listened to it, it would sound pretty reasonable. But that's what kind of goofed people up about this kind of speech synthesis, or speech synthesis in general. If you know what's coming, it's easier to accept that it's going to work. But with no knowledge, which is the case for someone who's implanted, it's really hard to decode what this is. And so I made a big fuss and I said, we're not doing the right thing. We need to have something that sounds more like speech and doesn't just convey pitch and loudness, but needs to convey something else, which I'm going to get to in the next slide. And when I suggested that, I met with a lot of discouragement, okay? A lot of people said, no, don't do that. You got to do formats. Or there's variants of formats, front cavity resonance. You should work on that. Combine a few formats. It's because we have 3 electrodes that are working, not 4. And I didn't feel comfortable with that. So I talked to Dr. White. And the good thing about Dr. White, he said, if you believe it less, pursue it. And so let's go to the next slide.
Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue. to hold. Her nature.
There's the next slide. So in order to move from this point on, to move in the direction where we can convey something more than just pitch and loudness, we needed to have a better control over the waveforms, over the stimulation waveforms. Because it's not that our software systems to do that were great, but the interface as defined by stimulus 4 and stimulus 8 later were a little limited because they were assuming that pulse rate, and meaning pitch, and pulse charge was sufficient. And I figured, well, we got to do something more than that. We need to get something else in to get phonetic information. So I put together this box, current pulse stimulator, CPS, built it from scratch, designed it myself. It interfaced to what Rob talked about with the PDB-11. It connected to Rob's interface, his software interface. And Matt Herndon put together the experimental paradigms and software for this. We ended up with 8 separate channels that could be controlled. With the subjects we were working with then, we only had 3 or 4 channels we could work with. But we were then able to do more arbitrary stimulation patterns on the subject's electrodes. This was not portable. This was in the lab. This is not something you take home, but it was to get insight on what we would do for our next portable system. So let's go to the next slide. And so what I did is shown in this figure from my dissertation. I figured we need 2 things. We need to convey timbre. We need to convey pitch, because in speech, as the pitch changes, you've got, prosody in speech, question statements, stuff like that. As the timbre changes, that's what you need to be able to convey phonetic information. Difference between E and A, it's not a pitch difference. Okay, some people could say it's maybe represented as frequency. I won't argue that, but it's not primarily a pitch rate difference. It's a timbre difference. So the figure on the left shows one of the stimulation patterns I tried, which gave us the most promising result, kind of exciting result. It was a pattern which is like damp part of speech. It had 2 separate parameters, actually 3, including loudness that you control. 2 separate parameters that controlled the phonetic-like information. The first is the major period, which corresponds to pitch in speech. That was the hypothesis. Then the minor period that corresponds to resonant frequency. And when we worked with the subject, the implanted subject, and played different stimulation patterns and looked at what happened when you change that major period, the overall periodicity, was a difference in pitch, as we expected. When you played 2 versus 3 milliseconds for that major period as a contrast, an ABX paradigm, the shorter period was a higher pitch one. Yeah, that's what we expected. That was encouraging. But then when we changed the minor period, very small differences in the minor period were discriminable. Furthermore, that discrimination was not based on pitch. The subject said, no, it's not that one's higher pitch than the other. That first stimulation pattern was duller sounding. The second one was sharper sounding. And I remember the subject saying, kind of like the difference between E and A, and we went, yay, that's what we need. So we realized that a more complicated waveform, one that has resonant information at the same time as pitch information. In fact, probably the time has told us that resonant information is more important, and how you convey that is more important. So this suggested a new way to convey and code speech in the time domain. Let's go to the next slide.
Before you do that, so did the major and minor periods have to be integer multiples of each other, or were they arbitrarily? Did they have to be integer multiples, the number of minor periods of the major?
No.
Okay.
No, they're actually not. I never really investigated how useful it was. I do remember that the minor period differences were very small, very high resolution discrimination. But I never really looked into whether they had to be integer related or not. That's a good question.
The figure maybe asked that. I wasn't sure. The figure suggests integer multiples.
Yeah, the figure might look that way because it was easier to draw it that way.
Yeah, fair enough.
But but it's not something we ever pursue.
Cool.
Okay, next slide. So we ended up with something that did this kind of stimulation pattern. It did a detection to find something like the finer envelope or temporal fine structure in speech, run it through a bunch of different bandpass filters, for example, one bandpass filter for each channel, find out what the temporal fine structure is, and we reported on that in the New York Academy of Sciences, 1983, this paper. Matt Herndon, second author. Laurel Dent, Blair Simmons, and White were also authors. That was a really interesting meeting to go to and present these results. Next slide, please. And after that, or about when that was happening, Simmons and White had partnered with an entrepreneur to form a company called BioStim in Princeton, New Jersey. And at that point in time, BioStim thought we were close to open set speech perception. We hadn't thoroughly tested that yet. And I was getting married, finishing my PhD. White and Simmons thought I did enough years. They encouraged me to interview at BioStim for a job. I declined their job offer, mainly because I also had some job offers in academia, and I preferred going to academia, my original plan. But my colleagues who worked with me while they were visiting at Stanford were so helpful. That's Inga and Erwin Hochmeyer in this picture here. They went back to Vienna and founded the Austrian cochlear implant company, MED-EL, which has gone on to great things. And it was very interesting to watch that happen. Now, MED-EL's cochlear electrode array is not limited to 3 or 4 electrodes, it's 12. That's a picture of their current electrode that goes into the cochlea. And I don't know what kind of difference there is being in the medialis versus being in the cochlea. Some people say there really isn't a difference. Others say there's surgical issues that make it different. I can't address that myself. But so that's what ended up happening with after I had that result. I went on to University of Washington. Didn't work much in cochlear implants until maybe 10 years ago when I did some work on cochlear implants and music perception, which itself was a separate issue, but very interesting. Next slide. And so the success of cochlear implants, many contributed to that. I'll list some of the people. You've heard from some of the people at Stanford. Of course, Blair Simmons and late Robert White, both were fantastic. Blair was a pioneer. White then worked with Simmons from the engineering side. UCSF, we've got people like Robin Schindler, Mike Merzenich, Robin Michelson, and others listed here, including Bob Shannon and Mark White. Hausier Institute, Bill House, and Bill House, it turned out, was good friends with Simmons. They were competitive with each other, but they would whitewater raft with each other. I'd hear those stories. University of Washington and people like Sandy Spellman, Joe Miller, and Jay Rubenstein was just finishing his PhD. He's now head of otolaryngology at UW. And then Inga and Erwin in Vienna. Don Eddington in Utah. Don went on to Peabody Ear and Eye Institute. Chouard in Paris, Melbourne, Graham Clark, Jim Patrick, I'm sure you people know them, and in Cambridge, Stuart Rosen, Brian Moore, Fortune, and others who were at Cambridge did great work. Let's go to the next slide. And this is 1983 Gordon Conference that was put together. It's the first large worldwide conference on cochlear implants. And some of the people in the picture, you won't see if I point, but I can tell you on the lower left at the bottom is Dennis Klatt. And he's the father of speech synthesis, the late Dennis Klatt. Very well known for his speech synthesis that came out of MIT. And on the middle, not in the middle, but a little left of the middle, you can see in the white shirt in the first row is Blair Simmons. Upper, I'm looking for White. White is in there somewhere. Oh yeah, and 1, 2, 3, third row, there's White right there. And he's above Inga Hochmeyer, who's next to Erwin Hochmeyer. And so many of the people there are good friends of mine, and some still are wonderful friends of mine. So we're open for questions now.
Les,
I look forward to questions. You can put them into the chat.
Les, most important, what did you actually use in your patients when the project ended? Were you able to use all 4 electrodes?
3 out of, well, what ended up happening is some of the electrodes and I worked with 2 subjects. In both subjects, one of the electrodes had issues like caused vestibular stimulation leaking out or some facial twitch or whatever. So out of the 4 electrodes, only 3 could be used for experiments because there were artifacts from the 4th electrode. But we used We typically used all three.
And so you had 3 different formats on 3 different electrodes, or how did you use the 3 electrodes?
We discussed various ways of doing it back then. That's a good question, because back then we thought our biggest challenge was current spread. That the actual site of neurons that were firing coming from on the 8th nerve was broader than it should be, broader than it was with normal hearing. And we thought, because the current spread so much, and this came from other experiments, that the current did spread. It didn't get a small patch of nerves. It was a lot of the nerves, a big chunk of the 8th nerve that didn't necessarily correspond to natural speech was firing when we were stimulating it electrically. So one of our goals in using multiple electrodes was to shape the stimulation pattern in such a way that was more focused. Dirk von Compernoll worked on that using a deconvolution technique after I finished my PhD to get more tighter focusing. And at University of Washington, Sandy Spellman and Jay Rubenstein worked on what the fields were. So just to answer the question quickly, we tried to get more sharp in fields. But the other question is, how do you stimulate multiple electrodes simultaneously so they don't get in the way of each other? If you're not trying to focus fields, and the idea we had then is something like interleaving would be, which people still do now. Then if you need to have 3 or 4 electrodes or more electrodes of information, scan through the electrodes and just present things in sequence, where each electrode could correspond to a format or a subband for a channel vocoder or something like that. More questions coming in.
We have a question in the chat that says, what were the ethics requirements like during this time?
What were the ethics?
Yeah, that I think we're kind of the wrong people to ask about this, because Dr. Simmons was clearly the one who was dealing with the human subjects, qualifying them, and dealing with all of the ethical concerns surrounding human experimentation. I mean, so, you know, from the way I look at it is, from the engineering side, we just wanted to do our absolute utmost not to hurt anybody. That was the best we could do. So that's why we had, you know, like electrically isolated systems, or in the case of what Les built, a highly fault tolerant stimulator, so that we could be pretty sure we weren't going to do any damage from an engineering point of view. But I can't speak to, you know, the qualification process and the ethics back then.
There was a human subjects review board. I remember that.
Yeah.
Yes.
And was it as stringent as it is now? I don't think so, but it was pretty stringent.
Yeah, and
It was, my memory was that it was not nearly as stringent as it is today. I did have some conversations with Dr. Simmons about that particular topic, and he pressed me to be able to explain what the benefit to these individual subjects was. It was not merely that we were benefiting society by advancing the state of the art in cochlear implants, but rather what was a specific benefit to the specific subjects at the time. And as Rob said, Dr. Simmons was really responsible for that part of the project, but he pressed me to be able to answer those kinds of questions.
yeah, I know that our subjects were very much aware of the fact that they weren't necessarily going to get anything, that any real result, you know, from the work we were doing with them, that this was all highly experimental. But I remember, you know, both of them were super enthusiastic, basically saying, okay, you know, I know that I might not get anything in particular out of this, but I really want to participate, and, you know, I can always hope. So they were both very good about that and clearly aware of the situation. Say, Marty, can you unshare the presentation, because then we'll be a little bigger in our little thumbnails.
In a related topic, Dr. Portadova was asking if there's any infection issues in these early implants.
let's see. I don't know, you guys may remember, it seems to me.
I do remember.
One
There
of the
were
two,
some.
yeah, okay, go
Yeah,
ahead,
JM,
had an infection problem, right?
And there
I
was one subject who was explanted, and the implant came out because of infection. Obviously, the percutaneous plug puts that at risk. I remember Simmons looking at one once. He said, "Oh, geez, okay." There was obvious, not obvious, but there were signs of infection. So that was a challenge. That's why we wanted it to be have the stimulus for and other things that go under the skin. There was another question that came in the chat that I think overlaps this issue of ethics, but is also an interesting question. Let me read it, and then we can answer it. Did all of you think CIs would get as big as they have gotten today when you were working on this during your PhD, or did it look super far-fetched? I'm happy to answer that. Because with the things I'm talking about, not being able to get open set at the point in time, having infections and people getting expedited, encouraging people to think, hey, you're deaf, you don't have to be deaf, we can fix you. I felt awful. I lost sleep over that, to tell you the truth. And the reason that I chose not to go to a biostim company and work on this technology back in 1982 or 83, even though we were almost there, almost at that point, was because I felt it wasn't going to work. I thought, and if someone said 45 years from now, you'll be personally considering whether you're going to get your own implant, I said, absolutely not, okay? With Shaina demonstrating at our last forum how she could hear audience questions, which I couldn't hear because I'm pretty severely deaf. I think I need an implant. I think in a year or two I'm going to get one, and some people want me to get one, and I think I should get one. For me to be saying that, I would have never predicted that. I would have bet against that point, absolutely. And I kind of left the area running full speed away because I thought it was a waste of time. And it's interesting, part of that viewpoint was impacted by our NIH site visit. Lou Breda and Nelson Kang thought cochlear implants are not the right way to proceed. They're not going to work. That's what they said. I think these are smart guys. Maybe they're right. And so I was quite discouraged. It turns out that over time, Nelson Kang changed his tune to say single channel cochlear implants are never going to work, but multi-channel will, which has turned out to be the reality we live with now.
Yeah, I have to say, for me personally, I don't think I thought very much about this question because it just seems so far in the future. I mean, if you'd worked on engineering projects before, you knew that things could go on a long time before any good stuff happened. Another aspect of it was we were already starting to see electronics moving along so fast and software moving along so fast that I could kind of imagine that one of these things might work if we just worked out a few details. But I think the bigger truth was that when I was working on this, I just had my head down, buried in trying to get this stuff done. And there really wasn't time for anything like that. I was just trying to do all of the measurements, do the best we can with what we've got and see where that leads. And then, you know, leave it to Les and Matt to figure out the next step.
Mhm. I recall from our initial panel, I was talking with Matt, I believe, and I was just explaining to him kind of how the implant has shaped my life. And I remember kind of the shock on his face that it had evolved into something where I could be as functional as I was, to the point where sometimes my own father forgets I'm deaf. And so I remember that struck me very much when I met all of you guys, is that it was just nice to be able to be in your presence and kind of be a evidence of the fact that your work has actually yielded something. I think I was surprised that you guys were just kind of in it for the love of learning, for the love of the science, and to make it happen and keep your head down, like you said, Rob. But it's nice to kind of tie it back to, hey, this is actually working. And I remember that was really surprising for me, that it was such a shock, and to see the shock on Matt's face. Going into the next question.
I think just one more quick thing about that. I remember talking with Matt some about this, and for him, and I think, you know, the others of us could argue this also, looking back on my career, this was the most dramatic thing I was involved in any sort of really substantial way. I was involved in a lot of other stuff over time with, software related integrated circuits. And, so I did my bit there. But this was looking back in time. It was just a wonderful moment in so many regards, the opportunity to do this. And then, as Les was saying, I mean, Doc White gave us pretty free rein to try whatever we thought might work. It was a wonderful, highly multidisciplinary research project. And it was great that, so I'm this PhD student in electrical engineering, and I can talk to anybody at a certain level about what it is I'm trying to do. It's not some abstruse mathematical thing, about kinds of matrices nobody's ever heard of. No, we're trying to make deaf people hear. Oh, that's good. You should work on that. But anyway, okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's remarkable. We have a question from Tim. It says, such a privilege to hear from a few of the pioneers of the cochlear implant research. Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering what your opinions are on the current state of cochlear implant research. What are exciting developments to you? And have there been any, quote, wrong turns in your opinion? I know a few of you have kind of gone on to other ventures, but if this is relevant to you, we'd be interested to hear some of your answers.
I guess, Les, if anyone can talk to that, it's going to be you, because I know what Marty has done, I know what I have done, and it's been in entirely separate directions from cochlear implants. So other than being a sort of spectator watching these things develop and improve, I don't have any real insights into them. How about you, Les? Have you
Rob,
followed this?
before Les goes, when did you realize that this was going to be a success? Do you have any recollection of, wow, this is really real?
So not during the time that I was a student working on it.
But afterwards.
Yeah, it was during the 1990s that I started reading about successes, and that was really, I think, surprising to me, or intriguing, or gratifying, or something, that this stuff was finally finding its way into the mainstream and making differences in people's lives.
Yeah.
With me, that what happened, one of the things that happened after I became a professor is I worked in audio coding, the kind of stuff that allows MP3 to convey music with low bit rates and to make it even sound better. So I always have been interested in music. It wasn't my main research, but a side issue. And as I was doing that, some people reached out to me and said, hey, we know people with cochlear implants, or I have a cochlear implant, or my child has a cochlear implant. They do not hear music well. Can you help it make music sound better in cochlear implants? And this was maybe 10 or 12 years ago. And if you take a look on NPR, if you search in my name, look at cochlear implants and music, you might see there's a nice radio program that they did where I was interviewed. A few other people, including a cochlear implant subject, was interviewed, who was a musician, about cochlear implants and music, because 12 years ago, the state of the art was so-so in terms of, it wasn't good, put it that way. They've made some progress with cochlear implants and music, making it sound better, more melodic, maybe, but I think a lot more can be done. What we did about 10 or 12 years ago was pretty impossible to get working real time. The real-time version needed some compromises like Rob had to do in the code we used to make things real-time. And those compromises were audible, and they made music not sound as good. They made the timbre of music a little off. And I think now processors are much faster than they were 12 years ago. So the same kind of idea in a real-time system, portable system for music and a cochlear implant. I think you can get better music in cochlear implants. I know people are working on that now. I think they could even do better. So I'd say that's a direction that things should proceed in. My love of music, and of course I've lost my hearing, so that's personally important, which is why I'm making a pitch for that.
Shana, go ahead.
Hi, I received a message from Dr. Blevins, who is one of the esteemed neurologists at Stanford, and it's an honor that he can join us. He'd like to make a quick comment.
Yeah, I thank you, Shayna. I think this is wonderful, and I want to take this as a selfish moment to thank the panelists for all of the hard work and dedication that went into this. I have to say I'm the chief of otology neurotology here. We've done well over 1,000 cochlear implants over the time that I've been here for the last 20 years. It is really a highlight of my career to see people benefit from the hard work that you all have put in and the foundations that you put in. No one can say that better than Dr. Cooperman, right? I mean, we can see the results as clearly as anybody possibly could in her success. But there are lots and lots of other patients like her, maybe not achieving quite the same level of achievement as she has, but almost all of our patients who get cochlear implants these days have a substantial benefit and a life-changing benefit. So this is just an opportunity for me publicly to say thank you for all the work that you did in allowing this to happen for us and our patients.
Thank you so much, Dr. Blevins. I think that's actually a perfect note to wrap this up with one final question. And that is, looking back on your work as your PhDs, what are you most proud of?
Well, I'm proud of just being able to work and contribute on this project. It's far and away the most significant work that I've done in my entire career. And that we did this early work in this field is a tremendous form of satisfaction for me personally.
Yeah, I think I would say a similar kind of thing. I mean, it's the proud of is it's kind of a strange way of putting it. I mean, I just feel happy to think about what we did, what happened. Sometimes a little bit amazed actually looking back at what we did with resources we had. So that's another aspect of what I'm proud of is what the team was able to do with the resources we had available. You can take looking at today's computing and electronics resources. Well, let's put it this way. What we tried to do back then would have been a lot easier if we had those sorts of things available to us. So, even though we were still fighting through trying to get open set speech, I'm definitely proud of all of these obstacles we fought our way through and found ways around. It really was, if I may say so, pretty clever.
Well, I thought that one thing that I remember the most is that impacted me the most, other than working with these brilliant folks who were my collaborators, was I learned that questioning the status quo was okay. And it didn't feel right when I first did it. I was very uncomfortable going against what everyone was saying. People with PhDs, people with MDs were saying, do it this way. And I said, I don't think that's right. And it took a lot, and fortunately, Robert White encouraged me. He helped my confidence to be able to do that. And over the years, I've learned now when I question the status quo and people get mad at me, I say thank you, because I know maybe I'm on the right track. So, 45 years later, most of the time when I question the status quo, I'm wrong, but sometimes you're not.
Thank you.
Well, thank you guys all so much. I know we're kind of going up against time here, but I just wanted to once again kind of publicly thank you guys. It's the second time we've done this, but it's no less impactful. Truly, your work has changed my life, has changed so many thousands of people's lives, like Dr. Blevins said. And it's really just an honor to know your names and put a face to your names and interact with you guys. I mean, not only are you amazing engineers, you're also just wonderful people. So thank you so much again for all of your life-changing work.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Malcolm, for arranging for this opportunity for us to talk about the work we did, and in particular talk about the work and the role that Doctors White and Simmons had in this field.
This has been great. Thank you. And I don't remember if we talked about this when the meeting started, but the speech processor and this video are going to the Computer History Museum, and the hope is that they'll be displayed later this summer. So I'm glad that we have this opportunity to make it a permanent record. So thank you all. Good day, everybody.